So we've reached Mark chapter 8. We've done the feeding of the 5,000 a couple of chapters back. We're now slightly ambitious and we're up to feeding 4,000. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way home. Some of them have come from far away. His disciples answered him, how can we feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said, 7. So he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves. And having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set before the crowd, and they had a few small fish too, which, having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away, and immediately got into the boat with his disciples, and he went to the district of Dalmanutha. So, before we get into this wasn't Jesus' first trip to this part of the world. He'd been there before, back in chapter 5. That visit didn't go quite so well. He was asked to leave. It wasn't a great day for pig farmers either. He'd just driven out a legion of demons who'd gone into the pigs, trashed the pig industry in the locality. The locals came out to find out what had happened, and they asked him to go away. The man he'd healed asked to go with him, to join him, and he said no. He said, you go home. You tell your family and your friends all that God has done for you. And I just wonder, because he went through what's called the Decapolis. I'll come to that in a bit. He went through all these towns and cities, just celebrating and telling everyone what God had done. And perhaps, possibly, he was the seed corn for this visit today. And as Rich said earlier, as Ali has said in the feeding of the 5,000, those of us who've been Christians for a while, over the years, it's easy to lose sight of the extraordinary wonder and excitement of these days with Jesus. Those who knew and surrounded him, but also those who came to him in want or need or hope, they were never disappointed. They were never failed. But you could imagine, could you imagine ever sitting 3 days straight through a church service? Just to be part of something unique or special or extraordinary? It's beyond our imaginations, isn't it, really? But they did, this crowd. Surrounding Jesus, they went 3 days without food because he was there, and they wanted to be where he was. He was the only reason they were in the middle of nowhere in the first place, and they had nothing to eat. What you going to do about that? But such was, and it's so easy to lose sight of what church is and who Jesus is. He's full of that attractive magnetism that people would flock from miles away just to reach him and spend time in his company. Can you imagine that? To hear what he had to say, to receive grace and healing and new life with hope. Just before we get into this passage, the crowds were saying, he has done all things well. And people were so overwhelmed with amazement, they couldn't keep quiet about what they'd seen and heard. Can you imagine that? So full of amazement and joy and surprise that it just overflows. Something you just can't keep in. It's extraordinary, spontaneous, and irrepressible evangelism born of joy. What's not to like about that? It's drawn yet another crowd of people flocking to Jesus to see and hear for themselves. But this isn't the same crowd of people that we've ever met so far in the journey through Mark's Gospel. Those who surround Jesus here are a different group of people. So in this stretch of Jesus' ministry, he's reaching out to what might be called the remnant peoples of Israel. Now, they're living in parts of the land which was originally settled by Israel, right back at the time they'd left Egypt. And the land was divided that God had promised, and tribes settled in different parts. 2 tribes had settled in this part. Two tribes had settled in this part. He's going to be wanting the mic in a minute. It's fine, absolutely fine. I love the hat. So 2 tribes had settled in this part, but when it all went wrong and they lost the land and they were exiled, when God brought his people home once more, they literally were just a ragtag bunch of remnants. They could no longer fill the whole land that had originally been populated with them. And these outlying parts of Israel, you're talking the north to the east, north to the west, and round to the east of the Sea of Galilee, they never fully regained their Jewish identity in the way that Judea and Jerusalem did, where you had all the temple and everything else. Over the years, it was Greece, actually, that became the dominant influence in that space. And the cities of the Decapolis, or quite literally, it's just 10 cities. It's a bit boring, isn't it? Sounds better, Decapolis. But they were founded as Greek cities. That's what they were. They were totally Greek. You're wondering why they had a pig industry there. It was for all the sacrifices that they were doing. They were pagans. They were cities of Greek culture. And so were a substantial number of people who lived there, pagan, not Jewish. But there were in this mixed economy those who were also Jewish. Jesus is reaching out to these right now, but touching everybody else as well. So here in this crowd surrounding Jesus now is this total mixed economy of worldviews and ideas. Some would be Jewish. They're living in this largely pagan-influenced land. They were looked down on by their southern neighbors. And whenever we translate words from one language to another, it's easy to lose some of the meaning, because words don't literally translate. But here, Jesus quite literally describes them as a ragamuffin bunch, a bit of a mob, is what he's describing them as. So probably not the types you'd find out hanging out in Jerusalem and places like that. But here they were, surrounding Jesus for 3 straight days to hear and receive from him. Back at the 5,000, it's the disciples who come to Jesus and say, these guys are getting hungry. How are we going to feed them? Send them away. But here it's Jesus who comes to the disciples and says, I have compassion on these people, this ragamuffin mob. He's the one who's deeply moved and the need for food before they make a journey home. So it's the disciples who raise their concerns. How we're going to feed this lot. By this time, of course, the disciples are well used to finding themselves in the middle of nowhere with Jesus and no access to a local cafe. So they've taken their own packed lunch. They're well supplied. They've got bread. They've got fish. They're sorted. Everybody else, it's their own problem. But Jesus says, what have you got? He takes what they've got. And the thing I love about this, that even no matter how big a gathering you are part of, it's possible to draw it down to the most intimate experience of being. He gets them to sit down. He takes the bread, as he would do in any home he gathered in. He gives thanks to God with those ancient words that are still prayed today in thanksgiving for bread from the earth. He breaks it. And through those disciples, it's hand to hand passed through this huge crowd. The handful of fish are shared too. Everyone eats until they are satisfied. Lunch doesn't have an early finish. Everyone is satisfied. Any natural calculations that you have about possibility cannot be imagined here. Any human scale of provisions are beyond thoughts. And so much of what we hold true as church is human. It isn't a work of God. Here is a reach and trust and ambition in God that is beyond human calculation. Again, it's lost in translation, the word for baskets, to collect up all the leftovers. So back in chapter 6, there were 12 baskets of leftovers. Here there's just 7. But the economies of scale, again, are very different. In feeding the 5,000, the 12 baskets were essentially lunchbox-sized baskets. That's all they were. Quite domestic things. Here, these 7 baskets were huge. When Paul was let down from the walls of Damascus to escape from persecution, you have to go to another book for that one. He was let down in one of these baskets, and here there's 7 of them. They were huge things, and they were filled with all that was left over from this feast. This feast, though, unlike all the others, unlike the party on a hillside for 5,000, they were all for Jewish people. Here, it's a ragamuffin crowd in a largely Gentile-settled part of Israel because Jesus had compassion in their need. Some few years ago, John Ortberg wrote a book titled, "If You Want to Walk on Water, You Have to Get Out of the Boat." He was thinking of the time that Peter, walking on water, or giving walking on water a go in Matthew 14. The point is that you can't play safe. You cannot play safe if you are looking to make faith great again, as Jim was saying last week. You cannot play safe and have an adventure with Jesus. It's not possible. And if you want to walk on water, push the boat out a bit. Don't go for the shallows. It's very unimpressive. I did, years and years and years ago. Some of you know I lived in Denmark for some years. And I did actually walk on water once. Okay, so it was frozen, but, you know. It wasn't even a step of faith. It was seriously frozen. But again, if you're going to experience and be part of a movement of God, and that's what Christian faith is. It's a movement of God. It's nothing static. We gather here to give thanks and celebrate his goodness and grace, and the wonder of all that he's done for us in thankfulness. But the point is, you move beyond these walls and you go back to where people are, because the gospel is all about people. It's about nothing else. It's all about people. But Jim spoke last week of George Muller, the guy who came over and opened Ashdown Orphanage in Bristol. And he spoke of him quite literally, and it is the truth. He would get the kids to sit round the table and say grace when there was literally no food to put on it, and God would miraculously provide. So, okay, if we tried that today, we'd get shut down real smartish. But for our faith to be great, our heart for those who don't yet know Jesus has to be great too. Our heart has to be open to an adventure we've not had yet, because we've never been here before. We don't yet know these communities. We don't know where God is already at work, but he will be. He's here, and that's why he's brought us to join him. For faith to be great, it has to have a quality of reach and ambition. Otherwise, it'll never be a work of God. It will only ever be a work of good-hearted people doing their very best. For years as a young Christian, I don't know if this was ever true for you guys, I prayed for the gift of tongues. I never received them. People prayed for me, people laid hands on me, nothing. Back then, my personal faith was much more a thinking faith. I leaned towards apologetics. I leaned towards academic theology. I was a very different person altogether. Ask Jessica. But that was where I was heading. That was my pathway before I met Jessica, and before the Bishop of London said to me before I entered training, will you promise to take a parish before you go into any sort of academic stuff? And obviously I never went back. I was grumbling to a Christian friend once, remembering that I'm that kind of person who thinks things through. I still do. I was grumbling that I hadn't received the gift of tongues, though I prayed for them many times, and he said to me, Chris, what would you do with a language you can't understand? And I thought, fair point. So I forgot all about tongues. But when I started training for ministry, I was stuck in a placement in a church, St. Peter's in Monk Wearmouth in the northeast, that had views so liberal and way out that I couldn't connect them with my faith, which is biblical, at all. And I had no idea I was going to survive. Had to get dressed up. It was a technical difficulty because I couldn't climb stairs in the dress and all that kind of stuff. It was a nightmare. And I was stuck in it for 3 months, and I had no way to get out. I could do nothing to escape it. I tried. One Sunday morning I was driving to this placement, and I'd run out of prayers. You know, you fall into that routine, you pray the prayer and you wait for an answer and nothing happens, and it just becomes a kind of habit or a rote or a liturgy in its own right. Nothing happened, and I just fell silent, and I'm driving along, and I just felt this strange bubbling in my chest. It was weird. And I just opened my mouth, and out came this stream of sound. So I shut my mouth because it wasn't normal. I opened my mouth, and out it came again. And it's been coming out ever since. But you know, I do recognize that while ever I could solve my own problems, I had no dependency on God. You know, people talk about temptations, don't they? And what gets in the way of your relationship with God? And what were the stumbling blocks in your relationship with God? What do you need to wrestle with? For me, it's me. For me, it's always been me. A natural problem solver. You know, I don't complain about things. I want to see them solved, resolved, and dealt with. I do that. But I couldn't receive from God until I was completely dependent on him. I was completely dependent on him. And there was nothing else to do. And the same is true for us. We're a family that God has gathered and is gathering in this place. And unless our faith has reach and ambition that carries us so far out of our natural depth, not recklessly, or maybe a bit, but unless it carries us into that space of dependence on God, our faith will never be great. It will always be human, shaped and sized. Now, I've spent 2 weeks with our forging, so I already know that there's a scale of reach and ambition, which is usually mine. I'm in a place thinking to myself, okay, we just need to rein this in again. But no, we don't. No, we don't. Our faith has to have reach and ambition that is truly faith. Not just a piece of social work or whatever. It has to have ambition. Possibly a bit reckless as well, because getting out of a boat in the middle of an ocean, and it was a choppy ocean as well, isn't something you do wisely. Secondly, our faith has to be Jesus-shaped. Forget your experience of church through history and so far, because it has to have all the qualities of mesmerizing attractiveness that is Jesus. You know? Those qualities of depth and substance that drew people to him in droves and would cause them not to leave even when they were hungry. Now, I know we can't imagine a church service lasting that long. That is a bit much. And Bev would kick us out at closing anyway. But there has to be a quality of attractiveness to how we express our faith that is born of Jesus and not ourselves. There's got to be a depth of substance to our faith and our expression of faith that connects with people with such a depth of meaning that they truly are connected and held with passionate grace. Christian faith at its truest is quite naturally attractive because, you know, it's a human life that is filled with God's Spirit. It's filled with the love and the light of Jesus himself. It's filled with God's lavish generosity and grace to those who come to him wearied and disillusioned, and there's a lot to be disillusioned about in our world today. Come to me, all who are weary, all who are burdened, and you will find rest. Great faith has its heart those qualities of generosity of spirit that would feed 4,000 and have the same left in leftovers. That's the scope and scale of our ambition as we reach those who are lost for Christ. That generosity of heart that knows very few boundaries. And finally, faith that knows no boundaries. The gospel is all about people wherever they are. Jesus ventured to this land where most of those who were there knew very little of who Jesus could possibly be for them. Very little. They'd had one experience and it scared them witless. But someone went and told them that that was not so, that he was full of grace and truth and lavish love, and he was there for their good. And that testimony drew them back like a magnet to him. Over the past few weeks, twice now, Jim has stood up here saying stuff like, make faith great again. The other week, at our prayer meeting, you had the same praise. Stephen prayed a prayer that came from the depth of his boots, just welled up and overflowed. There is a hunger, not just in our church, but in the world, for a Christian presence that is not just authentic, it is magnetic in its qualities of compassion and grace, not just its truth, but truth with love at its heart, that hopes and perseveres for the best. God, give us the grace to be such a people for this time and this age and this day. In Jesus' name, amen.